Q&A sessions. We will now proceed to our first agenda of today's seminars, which is the keynote session. This keynote session will feature two distinguished speakers who will share their insight and wisdom of international law and regional cooperation. We believe this session will spark provoking discussions and offer comparative perspectives that enrich our understanding of the law across borders.
Esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, before I invite our distinguished speakers for this keynote session, let me briefly introduce our speakers' outstanding background. Our first keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Vivian Louis Forbes, is an eminent expert in maritime boundary law and ocean governance. Currently, Professor Forbes serves as a distinguished research fellow and guest professor at the China Institute for Boundary and Ocean Studies at Wuhan University, as well as an adjunct research professor at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in Hainan, and in his home institution, the University of Western Australia in Perth, he is an adjunct professor at the School of Earth and Environment.
And also with over 200 publications to his name, including seminal Acls, books, and journal articles, Professor Forbes' work spans critical issues from maritime boundaries in South and Southeast Asia to polar regions and remote island territories. His combinations of practical experience and deep expertise in cartography and profound knowledge of international law has made him a sought-after consultant for governments and international bodies. The speakers will be delivering his keynote speech for about 20 minutes. And also the Q&A sessions will be done soon after both our keynote speakers have delivered their respective keynote speech. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Vivian Louis Forbes.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening. That's important. My topic today I've chosen is three important words: implement, cooperate, or arbitrate. If that all fails, then we say, well, leave it to the future lawyers. Okay, love, you're all lawyers now, and you want a job. But if I phone you, don't say 10 ringgits for the first half a second, because I can't afford it. So, it's important to understand what these three concepts are and why we have so much problems in deciding which one to choose. Lawyers will give you the most difficult way to go about it, because then it takes longer to solve the problem. So I'm very facetious when I come to this issue. My next slide. I'm going to allow you to indulge in this podcast, which is about 3.5 minutes, if you just invite them to listen to it. Thank you.
Malaysia's Maritime Jurisdictional Limits, an appraisal by Professor Vivian Forbes. The output of this volume contributes to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. This book adopts an interdisciplinary approach to maritime boundary delimitation and uses Malaysia as a case study. The country may be considered zone-locked in the context of the 1982 UN Law of the Sea. Malaysia's sovereignty extends beyond its landmass and internal waters to a belt of sea termed the Territorial Sea of Malaysia. Beyond this legal concept, Malaysia claims an exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, natural and outer continental shelf. The latter requires scientific justifications and for the area to be free from any sovereignty on territorial disputes. Apart from its well-written narrative, perhaps the most important aspect is the series of beautifully drawn maps and diagrams accompanied by detailed captions or commentaries, a unique collection worthy of publication on its own. The illustrations in this book offer an appreciation of the complexity of three disciplines. A special chapter focuses on the delimited maritime boundaries. Administrators, political scientists, academic researchers, and university the contents of this book. The annexure offers a complete set of primary documents. Professor Vivian Forbes is one of the world's most distinguished authorities on maritime boundaries. He has a master's degree, a doctorate, and a higher doctorate from Australian universities, and his advice is regularly sought by governments and institutions in Asia and Australia. He has lectured on the subject in many countries, displaying both his great learning and his diplomatic sensitivity. While based in Perth, Western Australia, he has held important distinguished positions across universities in China, Malaysia, and elsewhere. His erudition is based on a rare combination of practical experience at sea while serving as a merchant navy officer, a very detailed knowledge of the legal instruments of many countries appertaining to each and the relevant international agreements, together with an outstanding competence in the fields of navigation, survey, and cartography. These skills are supplemented by competence in administration. He managed one of the largest map libraries in the Southern Hemisphere with great efficiency for 36 years. Professor Forbes has a highly distinguished research record. He has published a number of books and several hundred papers in well-known and important journals. He is particularly well known for his atlases of maritime affairs. Professor Forbes' particular expertise is in the maritime regimes of the Asia-Pacific area, but he has also published extensively on the boundary problems of the Indian Ocean basin, the polar regions, and remote islands in many parts of the world. Adopting an integrated, multidisciplinary approach to the political geography of the Indian Ocean, his 1995 book, The Maritime Boundaries of the Indian Ocean Region, analyzes the law of the sea and evaluates the national legislation of the Indian Ocean. The aim of his 2001 book, Conflict and Cooperation in Managing the Maritime Space in the Semi-Enclosed Seas, was to assess the practice of liberal states through trans-border cooperation for the sustainable development of marine biotic and mineral resources and protection of the marine environment. Also included in the study was an evaluation of selected cases of dispute resolution over territorial claims and border discrepancies. His 2014 book, Indonesia's Delimited Maritime Boundaries, is an important contribution to the scholarly academic literature regarding maritime boundary delimitation. It also confirms the timely and indispensable role the rule of the law could and should play in conflict resolution and preventative diplomacy throughout the world in general and the South China Sea in particular. This volume should be of particular interest to those with an interest in maritime boundaries, conflict resolution, and ASEAN countries. Malaysia's maritime...
This was not a paid advertisement by him. You had to listen to 4 minutes of all of you. Better someone else saying it than you promised. I was very pleased that we were able to follow this work. Thanks mainly to a gentleman called B.A. Hamza. You know him? You can say Facebook. It was B.A. Hamza who tapped me on my shoulder back in 1987. And he said, "Babe, I like your job. I'd like you to do something for me." And because when somebody says, "I'd like you to do something for me," you have to say, "What are you going to do for me?" And he said, I'd like you to produce an atlas of the nation." To which I said, "Fine, what do you want? Is it color? Is it black and white? Is it A4? Is it A3? And so on and so forth." He said, "No problem, drop them out." He said, "We have all the money to spend, and we'll give every child a school atlas." Sadly, that wasn't to be, but the atlas was produced. So anyway, my talk is on limiting, cooperating, and arbitrating on maritime boundary issues. The slide shows you that there are over 50% of the ocean surfaces is clear. Jurisdictional extension has increased since the 1980s. Countries are wanting more sea space and importation. have and what they shouldn't have. Globally, there are about 365 potential maritime boundaries. I won't ask you to count them because overnight they could change. Another 20 or 30 if there's a fight somewhere in the world. The disputes tend to arise due to growing importance of ocean resources, access to the sea lanes, more importantly now, geopolitical tensions, overnight tension rises, and also seabed rights and hydrology. Seabed rights is even more important because people want to lay submarine cables on the seabed and it goes through territorial seas of different countries. And at the moment, there are about 50 cases before the ICJ that are related specifically to maritime boundary limitation. In our region, 3 cases went to the ICJ, 3 to Acls, 2 to the PCA, and 2 to compulsory conciliation. Part 14 of Part 15 of UNCLOS offers rules for the resolution of disputes between parties. I won't read through all of them, but you have the avenue of ICJ, ICLOS, ad hoc arbitration, and a special arbitration tribunal. In March 2002, Australia declared that it would not like to go to arbitration. It would rather settle its maritime boundary with its neighbors on a negotiated avenue. And we did that with Indonesia. Things political tension changed overnight, and so we had to go to arbitration. And of course, a lot of people Timor-Leste made to us to court, dragged us, I would say, but people say, no, you wouldn't drag, you went voluntary. Okay? So it's one of those things whether you are dragged or voluntary, and of course, the situation changed. So I'll show you 2 maps on this slide. You see time and space. On the one slide, on the left-hand side, are the letters M written where mediation has taken place. Such as 2 in the Bay of Bengal, 2 in the Tuna Sea area, a couple in the Timor Sea, 1 in the Philippines, 1 in the Arabic Sea, and 1 in the South China Sea. I don't think you want me to give you the examples, but you can still find it out. If you cannot find out which ones I said, just send me an email. Some of the issues that create these problems or create the program are fisheries, oil and gas activities, illegal operations, by illegal meaning piracy, ships anchoring in somebody else's waters without permission, marine pollution, that has been a big problem for a long time. And of course there are historical things. How far do you go back to a historical thing? Is anybody's guess? I'm only 21, so I don't know anything about historical things. Next one. One of the best ways, I believe, is to resolve the issue, is to have an outright implementation. It takes 2 parties, and there are going to be disagreements along the way, but at least you can put out a case to the other party. What it doesn't show is state sovereignty over its maritime boundaries. You can implement and enforce rules and regulations in your set of the boundary. And this is easy for me to say, but it doesn't always happen. The other parties always got another idea to create. And of course it ensures clarity and surety. we've seen boundaries that have been negotiated 10, 20 years ago, and to this day, there are still arguments over the boundary. Next one. This map, one that I've drawn, and which appears in the Malaysia jurisdictional limits map book, shows the negotiated boundaries and provisional boundaries. It also shows joint development zone or area between Malaysia and Thailand, and then a free common area between Malaysia and Vietnam. So Malaysia, I believe, has done very well with this maritime boundary issues to date, and so has Indonesia. And I've been fortunate to write for both countries, so I've given a balanced view in each case. So no favoritism, in my opinion. The biggest issue in the South China Sea is those red lines that are shown, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They are claims driven by China, which overlaps the other countries' claims. I want to touch on that subject because some of my classmates on this slide. The cooperative approach appears to be a very good way of resolving your issue. Malaysia has done the joint development area with Thailand. That's operating very well. A joint management zone mainly for fisheries or Arctic resources, and that's going very well with the Malaysia-Vietnam situation. China and Vietnam have also got a very good joint management zone, purely for fisheries. And then there are regional managements of specific marine resources, such as the tuna, yellow shad, whatever it's called. And finally, there's the International Seaweed Authority, which is not the beach, deep sea. I won't spend too much time on this. This slide just shows you some of the cases that have been taken to the International Court of Justice, ICLOS, and arbitration. Most of you are familiar with the cases of Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Singapore. One that's I've followed very closely, and I'm still waiting to hear the final results, are the closing of the gaps in the Straits of Singapore. To my knowledge, at this stage, there are 3 gaps still not filled. And I keep wondering myself, don't say it loudly, why is it taking so long to fill the gaps? When you have gaps like this, it's open to all sorts of illegal activity. Because people that are committing the activity will say, well, we didn't know gate was open and we went in. Close the gate, we won't be able to have. So that's something just to put in your back memory. I've intentionally put this slide up, because this shows the Indonesia-Australia maritime boundaries, 2 of them. That was signed on the 14th of March, 1977. And to this day, the treaty has not been ratified. When I asked my government, why hasn't the treaty been ratified? They said, what's the treaty? You don't need to know why it's not ratified. I said, I do need to know, because I get fishermen that call me from Timor Sea. I said, what's happening? We can't go there, we've been chased out, So, how many years? 37 years? From 1977 to today, the treaty is not complete. I'm not complaining about anybody, I'm just stating a fact. What is unusual about this treaty is there are 2 zones, one for seabed operations and one for autonomous operations. ask the other parties permission to go through the water column, put an oil rig, put a derrick. So in principle it was good, but in practicality it's not. And it's all very well to say, you're only a phone call away, send me an email, and get the reply, it says, no reply, Oscar, not call, whatever. So it's a sad situation. And when we had the domestic coming to the argument, and so sorry I break on purpose, but I think it's important that you guys know that there are issues like this around the world. Now, having looked at that map, the ICJ has a standard methodology for communication. It says it's a three-stage process, and they decided on a potential meeting time. And if you read down those points there, then they adjust the provincial meeting time. So there's some adjustment that takes place. It's not straight down the middle. And then to ensure that the proportionality requirements are met. That's the third step. The fourth step is the final boundary limitation between the parties to the dispute is an adjusted equidistant line. How do you get that? I don't know. But you lawyers know how to get adjusted equidistant line. Yes. And then one wonders after that, could or does the final line favor one party? So ICJ is very clever. They come up with this process, and finally it says, let's begin with you. So, thank you. Okay, I've talked about it. This gives you an indication of some of the books I've written over the years. I'm only 21, so that's very good. My pride and joys have been the two emphases of Malaysia and this recent book of Malaysia and of course the one of Malaysia. And then I put up this one, the South China Sea, and cheekily asked the question, can artificial intelligence resolve the South China Sea? If you say yes, then you're doing yourself on the job. Okay, so don't say yes. Say no, we can do it. Or should we leave it to a professor like me to go look it out, or to a geographer, or to a simple scientist? So on that note, you have to decide how you can resolve the problem.
Professor Forbes. Once again to all the dear guests, the Q&A sessions will be done soon after both our keynote speakers have delivered their respective keynote speeches.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next keynote speaker is Professor Dato' Dr. Rahmat Muhammad, one of Malaysia's foremost experts in public international law and dispute resolution. Professor Rahmat is currently a Lifetime Fellow at the University of Aberystwyth, Wales, United Kingdom. He is also a Fellow at University Islam Sultan Sharif Ali Islam in Brunei Darussalam and University Technology Malang UiTM Malaysia. Professor Rahmat has served in many prominent roles, including as former Secretary General of the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization (ALCO) in New Delhi, India, an intergovernmental body that plays a key role in shaping international law across two continents. Professor Rahmat also is a former chairman of the Asian International Arbitration Center (ARAC) and also the chairman of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. A highly respected academic, lawyer, and policy advocate, his contributions to international law, arbitration, and regional cooperation are widely recognized both in Malaysia and abroad.
The speaker will be delivering his keynote speech for about 20 minutes. Now, it is my honor to invite our second keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Rahmat Muhammad, to deliver this keynote address titled ASEAN ways of dispute settlement reforms for greater credibility. Please welcome.
Assalamualaikum. And a very good morning. Dear colleagues, friends, and of course the eminent Professor David. I think we have met many years ago. One of those occasions where you were invited to speak on the position of Malaysia. As you say, you remain neutral. on some of the maritime issues, I suppose. And I still respect him very much. I think he has done a great job in trying to delimit the maritime territory in this part of the world. But I must say that for government, it's not easy to really dispose the case. It requires many years of negotiation and deliberation. I know that every time when I visited and give my lecture in Indonesia, there is an issue of Sipidan and Lipidan, and this is really a very difficult issue for both countries, where the matter was resolved finally at the International Court of Justice. And I always mention to my Indonesian friend that you own 17,000 islands, and you miss or you lost 2 islands. I don't think that is very much different. Of course, we also lost our big rock against Singapore, Verablanca. That is something that is very much we don't look forward, but still that is the way that we move forward. And I have my difficulties also in trying to, as you, Professor Fogg, that why did we claim, for example, the South Ledge, for example, because the matter has been left without answer from the ICJ. So our government did not respond to that, and I have also difficulties in trying. Occasionally, Dr. Azmi and myself, we wrote articles in the newspaper. But academics, being too honest, sometimes it does not pay really. I mean, we are not a trained or career diplomat, so that is our biggest mistake. I think being academics, we hold dear to the truth. I think that is the most difficult. Now, related to what Professor Fox discussed earlier, I will only go into one of the. I really like this subject. It is my favorite topic. In fact, that is something that I have challenged me, and I did my PhD on ASEAN disputes happening in maritime. So obviously, I will be just talking on very briefly, because Dr. Azmi is telling me just in case of overstep on the timing. I will speak on the ASEAN ways of settling dispute. And recently, there's been much pressure to have reform for greater effectiveness and credibility. The recent ASEAN law meetings comprises of ASEAN law ministers, for example. The group suggested that perhaps it's about time for ASEAN to move forward and be more of a rule-based approach rather than what we have now. We call it ASEAN ways of settling dispute. But I must say that the recent event that is happening between Cambodia and Thailand, our Prime Minister played a very important role in trying to mediate the dispute with these two countries. And I think there is a room for ASEAN, therefore, to move ahead with what we call the ASEAN-based settling dispute. So you cannot, therefore, dismiss account of we should be looking at rule-based mechanism and forget about ASEAN way. In a way, for how many decades since ASEAN inception in 1967, despite the fact that we have mechanism like Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and then move on in 2005 as regard to the introduction of the ASEAN Charter, because before that everyone says that ASEAN is not a formal institution, and therefore ASEAN leaders make up the ASEAN Charter. If that, we thought, ASEAN would move the direction from more political based into rule based, but until today, unfortunately, we don't see that is happening. So, be that as it may, I think the way, the most important thing is, number one, ASEAN has been one of the most peaceful regions in the world, and I think they successfully managed the region well among themselves. Of course, we have the issue of Myanmar, but I think it will be resolved through quiet diplomacy and discussion among ASEAN leaders. I know it is very difficult to say, no, it cannot be done that way. We have to tell Myanmar that they are wrong and they have to move forward and do something, make sure that humanities are actually being preserved. But it is easier said than done, really. And after Indonesia, now Malaysia is taking the challenge. I would see that things are moving in Myanmar. What is important in Myanmar is that we do not want externalities or external forces to come in and do something there, because we believe that what is important is to maintain or retain the non-intervention principle. Mind you, non-intervention principle is a very much old doctrine that has been introduced in the Westphalian Peace Treaty. You know, that is actually something that all sovereign state has. When they become a sovereign state, no one should interfere. But in as far as Myanmar is concerned, it is quite difficult because you have some problem internally. And if you remember, former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, says that if there is human or the loss of human rights happening in your own country, that does not mean others cannot intervene. There must be some human intervention to make sure that there will not be a loss of life. So that is something that we need to consider, but it is unfortunately the idea of that intervention is very difficult at the moment. So the idea of non-intervention, unfortunately, is something that is really a challenge in ourselves. The other thing is the fact that we believe in consensus. The principle that we developed by Indonesia, the Mufakat and Musyawarah, for example, through consultation and consensus. This is another difficult or the most challenging task for ASEAN. We cannot make any decision based on majority, but we must be consensus. That's why you see things are not moving in this part of the world, especially in relation to policy decision or policy making. ASEAN, for example, if you travel abroad, in Europe, for example, the citizens of Europe will have a free flow of, in the immigration, but they say Europe and against the rest, for example. So we don't have that ASEAN relation. Today, unfortunately, we believe in harmonizing, we believe believe in working together, but that is not happening. Now, I mentioned about Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or the TAC. It was introduced in the early 70s, thinking that if we have problems, we should resolve this Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Unfortunately, it has never been invoked by any of the ASEAN states until today. So there goes your rule-based kind of approach. You thought that would be an answer, a solution to any conflict in this world, but the idea that ASEAN Way is still something that is working, and perhaps it will take a long time, but I think if you ask for reform, that will take maybe decades to happen. As you know, that there are two levels of ASEAN that we have at the moment, the founding members of ASEAN, then we have the Laos, Cambodia, fraction, and that itself, the economic gap between these countries is so wide that I think what is important for ASEAN is that they believe in their own, their home first, and then talk about region. After all, ASEAN, unlike the EU, is an intergovernmental organization of 10 countries. So of course, if that happens, the idea of working together or trying to harmonize the legal system, or even working together economically for the benefit of the ASEAN community will be perhaps secondary. Because what is important for ASEAN countries, state comes first, home comes first, and then later. So it is quite difficult to have, for example, a totally rule-based system to be enforced in this region. And when we talk about the rule-based system, so far Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, of course now you have Cambodia and Thailand, but that is again a different issue. But as regards to maritime issues, these are the countries that utilize the World Court for international justice as we want. So I would say finally that if we talk about, yes, we want to see reform. What sort of reform would we like to see? Is it a structural reform of the legal system? Is it which is very much rule-based? What do we want? Even if we have a rule-based system, if you look at the case, arbitration case between China and Philippines, for example, Philippines won the case, but until today, do we see any enforcement of that decision by the Court of Arbitration? Unfortunately, that's not, because that requires the diplomatic approach of ensuring that it will be enforced. So I believe that you cannot have a 100% rule-based approach. You perhaps have a hybrid between rule-based and diplomatic or political based. So I end the discussion there, and there will be questions from the floor. Thank you very much.
For your elaborate insight. Now, we will proceed with our Q&A session for both our keynote speakers. The floor is open for questions. Kindly raise your hand and state your name and affiliation before posing your questions and to whom the questions is addressed. So now it's open. Yes, you may.
Good morning. I'm Afiq and I'm from USIM, actually. So my question is to Professor Vivian Forbes. In regards to the law of the sea, how does the law of the sea accommodate the shrinking nations that will be affected by climate change? Because the zones of the maritime zones will be affected when where the land meets the sea. So how does the law of the sea handle these climate issues? I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much. Professor Force, you may answer now or later.
Whatever you want.
You can just answer. Thank you very much.
I was going to suggest perhaps I'll get my lawyer to answer it. That is a tough question, and there's lots been written on the issue, lots by academics. I personally haven't touched that because I'm more interested in the 17,000 islands that Indonesia has and the few that Malaysia have lost. That. It's something that the UN has taken notice of and has worked very hard to try and resolve the issue. And when you get countries that are saying, well, we better reduce our hydrocarbon usage, etc., and then you get another man from the other side of the world says, drill, baby, drill. We will keep drilling till we run out of oil. It's very hard to find the balance, and I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but I do know that people are working on it. And in Australia, we are in a particularly difficult situation, and I'm speaking for myself, not from the Australian government. We've got the island nations around us who are accusing us of creating climate change by burning coal and fuel and everything else. And we are, we recognize the situation and we're trying to help in every possible way. So if I find a definite answer, I will forward it to you. Or perhaps when we're having tea one day, we can sit down and talk about it. I'm sorry I can't give you anything too definite on this issue.
Thank you very much, Professor Ford, for your valuable answers. And now, is there any more questions? Yes, absolutely.
Good morning, honorable speakers and honorable guests and fellow participants. My name is Fahreza Matsugianto, a final year law student from the Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya. My question goes to Professor Forbes. Last year, in November, President Prabowo Subianto, the newly elected President of the Republic of Indonesia, signed a joint agreement with the People's Republic of China, which indirectly implied that Indonesia and China will collaborate on use of natural resources in the overlapping maritime claim, which this is implying that Indonesia indirectly acknowledged China's 9-dash lines claim over the South China Sea. Do you see this as a threat to other Asian nations, particularly Malaysia or Singapore, and how do other ASEAN nations can collaborate to prevent this issue into much bigger issue? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's another very tough question. I'm going to China next month, so I am genuinely. It's a difficult one. I can understand your president signing something to get things going. Indonesia has in the past taken a very tough stance on Chinese fishers coming into your Natuna Sea area. So, in one sense, I think that's been very good. We did the same in Australian waters in the Timor Sea, with Indonesian fishing boats, in which, again, I didn't like the idea. What's done is, to teach a lesson. With the China-Indonesia thing, how does it affect the other countries? But I think Singapore can be ruled out. There's no resources that Singapore has, maritime resources, that is. With Malaysia has done perhaps something similar. I won't say the same. There's been some sort of mutual agreement to do things. Of course, with Malaysia, there's the issue of the Laguna shoals, and China has been very tough on that. And I personally, now I'm saying this very openly, that sometimes you can turn a blind eye to something and, say, well, it won't happen again. But then it does happen. And when it happens again, the other party says, well, you didn't say anything in the past. And I'll give you one very good example. Back in 2015, I arrived at BMO's office in KL. And something was put on my desk and said, can we verify this? and it was a notice to mariners by the government of China saying we are going to put rigs in 8 of Sarawak, Brunei area, some of the Philippines, and some of Vietnam. So I queried it and I said, this doesn't look like a legitimate type of notice to mariners. And I was told, yes, it is. And local people here said, can you plot it and make sure that. Now I think that was what we call a red herring. Let's try it out. Let's see whether Brunei will create a problem. Let's see whether Malaysia will create a problem. And let's see if the Philippines create a problem. Vietnam is definitely going to create a problem. So sometimes you get these little things. I don't know the details of what your president has signed. In principle, it looks good. But so long as you don't give away the seabed. Now, when it came to the Timor-Leste, Australia situation, my own daughter said to me, she said, Dad, you're a hard man. You should give Timor-Leste all the oil. I said, sweetheart, I can give them all the oil. If I own a sweet shop, I would give the children all the sweets, but I won't give them the bottles and the table and the chairs and things like that. So once you sell your seabed rights, you can't get it back. So I hope both parties have done the right thing, and I hope I can still get to China next month. I hope I answered that. Okay. If I find out any more, I'll let you know.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. So we are now open for one more questions. Is there any? Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Emran Mafuji. I'm hopefully in my final year from Faculty of Law in Brawijaya, and I actually want to ask a question to Professor Rahman. There was an interesting statement that was mentioned regarding enforcement of decision or any form of dispute. If we look at our neighbors, the EU, they have a really interesting enforcement regarding any form of decision. One of the key factors of it, from what I know, is the states who are parties to the EU, they gave up some sort of their sovereignty. It's just a hypothetical of mine. Is it possible for Asia itself, if we want to evolve, not just stay in our quote-unquote Asian way, should we adopt a similar principle if we actually want to take dispute settlement seriously and enforcement seriously to settle matters in our region? I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a good question. I mentioned in my short presentation that the fact that ASEAN is actually an establishment of 10 states, that is the idea that it is not going to be elevated as EU, because EU most times you give up their sovereignty for structure or legal framework in that sense. So it's quite difficult. We just take a small situation like haze pollution, where ASEAN, among a few countries, have signed a treaty. But that question of enforcement is still, we have yet to see that any one of these states that has created the problem would be seen to be taken the responsibility. But it is difficult for us in that sense. That is why we have the alternative to that rule-based approach to what we have now, the ASEAN ways of settling dispute. But that does not mean that enforcement is not possible. But when you have bilateral issues, for example, two countries are having problems, especially resolving issues on maritime boundaries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. Rest assured that the matter will be brought up before the ICJ, and ICJ will I am not an advocate of rule-based system. I have to be honest about it. I am, I believe that the ASEAN ways it is important to maintain the relationship. When we had our case submitted to ICJ, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, we have this problem of trust. We have trust deficit. When we discuss with our counterpart from Indonesia, they will have this issue of whether we can trust our Malaysian friend in solving maritime boundary issues. So is Malaysia and Singapore. So that is one setback about giving up your. Of course, it will take time. It is something that cannot be resolved immediately because this involves kedaulatan negara. So how can you want to resolve it in years? No, it's not possible. But I believe that negotiation. I believe that the way that we handle things among leaders can be resolved at the end. Because I suppose many of us are not patient enough, especially the student community. So that is why sometimes we need to resolve it, through more official, that sense by going to ICJ or the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So it is difficult when you talk about enforcement. So we need time, and I think countries would need to recognize the importance of it. That's why I always believe the hybrid approach of rule-based plus political or diplomatic approach in resolving dispute. And that is possible, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to our distinguished keynote speakers and to the audience for your engaging questions. With that, we have now concluded our first agenda.
Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we now proceed to our second agenda, the plenary session. This plenary session will feature 3 distinguished panelists who will share their perspectives on key issues in international law. Our panelists are Associate Professor Dr. Benjamin Robin Barton, Head of School of Politics and International Relations, University of Nottingham, Malaysia.
Associate Professor Dr. Eko Widiarto, SIMHU, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Universitas Brawijaya, and also Associate Professor Dr. Faisal SIMHU, Head of Forum Dekan Fakultas Hukum, FORDEC, Muhammadiyah and Aisyah Higher Learning Institutions of Indonesia, and also as the Dean of Faculty of Law, Universitas Muhammadiyah Sumatera Utara. Each panelist will have 15 minutes for their presentations, followed by joint Q&A sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm pleased to invite our first plenary speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Benjamin Robin Barton, to deliver his presentation titled China's ASEAN Strategy. Please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again to colleagues at USIN for the kind invitation, esteemed guests and speakers, members of the audience. So I guess disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist. So I'm going to give you the big picture, and this is supposed to fill some of the gaps, I guess, which will be encompassing the discussions that we've already heard and will be hearing over the course of the day. And that's about China, which effectively is the elephant in the room. But I'm happy to see that and hear already that there are pertinent questions being asked about China, how China sees the region, how China engages partners, what China wants. So I think it's interesting for us to take a look at, perhaps from a broader-based perspective, how China engages ASEAN as a whole. So what I'm just going to do over the course of the next 30 minutes or so is to try and capture the way China engages ASEAN, right? And then perhaps also look ahead at what the major hot topic issues are between China and ASEAN at this moment in time. Now, some of these aren't necessarily 100% pertinent or relevant to the issue of the South China Sea, but they sit there in the background and they do have an impact because, of course, member states of ASEAN, Southeast Asian nations deal with China on so many levels now. There's such a strong degree of interdependence. Let's not forget that since 2020, ASEAN is China's #1 trade partner. It's difficult not to live in Southeast Asia and pretend like China does not exist. Okay? So, what is China's underlying motive for engaging in the region? Well, its aim is ultimately to drive the Americans out, which is, of course, very ambitious, probably too ambitious. Right? And there are different reasons why that is, notably with regards to Taiwan, but also to ensure that there is no American military presence in Asia writ large. That would make life so much easier for China. But we've seen that for the time being, that's not going to happen, unless, of course, Mr. Trump changes the dial. But of course, China would aim to do that without necessarily stoking conflict, right, which would be outright war to drive the Americans out of the region. It would do so in a way, playing perhaps a longer game, to get America to, or at least convince countries in the region to not want to engage the United States as a way to push them out without actually having to declare war on the US. So what we've been seeing over the past 2.5 decades now, is a strategy which of course is nowhere, right? This is a black box. This is us guessing effectively how this works. But if you put the actions of the Chinese state and the various actors who come to represent China internationally, how they engage countries in this region, what we see is a mix of different elements. There's a military element, of course, that's already been mentioned, which is also a psychological element to coerce, to thread fear into the minds of the states in the region. What if they do something? What if they step out of line? How will China respond? Yeah. Or, as we've already heard, China laying the groundwork to stem the fear of what China may or may not do in case of the Southeast Asian nation not behaving in the way that China would see fit. To that, there's also and this is a really strong argument, which is economic inducements, which is also tied to coercion. And that is when we talk about interdependence, when we talk about trade, when we talk about investment. After all nations in this part of the world strive for modernization, which requires engaging with the outside world. And as we've seen, China's positioned itself in a way where it has growing economic interdependence with the countries in this part of the world. There's soft power. I'm not going to touch upon all of these. I'm personally not really convinced about China's soft power. It comes in different shapes and forms. Yeah? Wolf Warrior 2, that was a great movie. That's not really soft power in the way that we traditionally understand it. But still, soft power is in the Chinese sense works perhaps different. It works in ways that we perhaps do not necessarily see behind closed doors. China can be quite influential. Sometimes things don't happen because of Chinese soft power. And that's another element of China's presence. And then, to join Prof. Rapa, perhaps in a less diplomatic way, and it's by no means something which I think alone, I think many people feel that this is an issue to be dealt with, is that China is very good at working the ASEAN group. That is, taking advantages of the cracks, the institutional cracks. The fact that there is no real ASEAN institutional framework. You're dealing with 10, 11 member states, right? You all have different interests. And China is particularly good at playing one against another. Not just in Southeast Asia, but in other parts of the world as well. In Europe, for instance, we talk about the European Union, but actually in the EU, the same problems exist that you have in Southeast Asia. It doesn't take many member states to undermine a collective position. And China's quite good at seeing that and taking it. Next slide, please. So, what we've been seeing is a push and pull factor the Chinese have been implementing over the past couple of decades. So the pull factor, which is to come across as benign, or to the contrary, to come across as a supporter of regional integration, of economic modernization. So that you can see via the material elements of the pull factor. Trade, of course, is a withdrawal investment. We've seen that over the years. Recently, under the aegis of the Belt and Road Initiative, multi-million dollar investments in infrastructure, in health. Of course, let's not forget when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, China's public diplomacy was in full tilt. Right? Distributing vaccines across the region being seen as wanting to contribute to the well-being of citizens in this part of the world. And then there's the immaterial element of China, and this comes back to its soft power, I mentioned. And that's pushing a certain narrative which appeals in the region. For instance, Asians for Asia, which comes back to this issue of wanting to undermine the American presence, the American influence in Asia and in Southeast Asia. But also talking of a community of shared destiny for mankind. Now, scholars or commentators still do not really know what this means. What's the deep in the granular element? What does it mean? But it doesn't matter because it's planting an idea of trying to build a parallel architecture, right? Where there is no American influence. Okay? And effectively, China, and this comes back also to the ASEAN way, or the values which ASEAN promotes, is also known for upholding political principles such as non-interference, which makes it popular vis-à-vis other foreign powers who perhaps don't indulge in upholding those particular values. That is complemented by the push factor, the harsher elements of China's approach to the region. As we've seen, the military elements, such as firing water cannons, or disguising fishermen for military purposes to advance China's causes to the upholding the Nine-Dash Line. There are also diplomatic threats of economic coercion over the South China Sea. The threat of losing out if one does not abide by China's wishes. There's, as I mentioned earlier, dividing and conquering of ASEAN, which is proved to be quite effective because sometimes ASEAN does not respond as one to the things which might hurt China, notably the ruling in 2016 at The Hague in favor of the Philippines. And, of course, there's also China trying to keep others out of the business of the South China Sea, such as, being, let's say, somewhat unhappy about seeing a European naval presence in the region and making that known to its European interlocutors. So that's, generally speaking, what comprises of China's strategy towards ASEAN. Now, of course, it's not a perfect one. It doesn't mean that it's foolproof or bulletproof. And in fact, I think over the past few years, there have been some issues, whether domestic or international, which have proven to be undermining China's position somewhat. First of all, economic growth in China is erratic at best. It has actually been stagnating for the best part of a decade. Some would say that, in fact, the official data which is produced by the Chinese government on the health of the Chinese economy, of course, is an exaggeration of the true nature of how the Chinese economy is doing. And therefore, how much can China afford to support this economic diplomacy, which is at the heart of its strategy, right? We see now with the Belt and Road Initiative that we're not talking about $1 trillion expense anymore. We're talking about small is beautiful, right? Because there's a contraction on how much China is willing to spend. There's the uncertainty, which doesn't help, of erratic American commercial policy, right? Tariffs, of course, which is one of Donald Trump's favorite foreign policy tools, and how much that uncertainty is also hurting China's economic position. And of course, the ongoing rivalry with the United States over tech supremacy, which, Of course, China is, if anyone's been to China recently, you'll see the advances made in certain sectors, quite impressive, notably EVs. But of course, China is also struggling to get access to some of the hardware needed to be able to maintain its ability to vie for supremacy. Then coming to some of the issues which, of course, are relevant to this conference, right? The South China Sea encroachments, some provoked, others not. But I suppose also the question mark, the one which has been there for, what, 2 decades now, over the code of conduct. Will it be signed this year? Will it be signed next year? Will it never be signed? Is it really in China's interest to have a code of conduct with ASEAN states? And as we see, one thing that China's been quite good at, coming back to this issue of dividing and conquering, is what is known in the academic literature as salami slicing. Right? Again, playing off one ASEAN member state against another. And how about the impact of growing US isolation from regional dynamics? For now, of course. Does that benefit China? Is that really something which we've seen having a positive impact on China's ability to influence developments in the region? There's still question marks, of course, on whether that's the case. And I suppose it always comes back, at least in my mind, to the issue of, and I think this was reflected in some of the questions already so far, of ASEAN's position as an institution. Is it capable of developing something akin to a united position on China? And if it were to, what difference would that make to China's ability in the region to expand its own influence? I'm very much of the opinion that a united ASEAN position would change quite a lot, but perhaps I'm just a dreamer, an academic who lives in an ivory tower, making up a new vision of the world myself. Anyway, what we have seen in the past year, particularly the Malaysian chairmanship of ASEAN, is a desire to engage China on the conventional topics, but also on unconventional topics as well, which I think demonstrates how much China is important to states in this part of the world. We've seen that with BRICS, for Malaysia, for Indonesia, for Thailand, that China's lead is important, and also wanting to form part of new groupings that China is a part of. And we saw that also at the ASEAN Summit, when the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council members and China were invited to as part of an important, or I'd say novel, trilateral summit. So, of course, it's always a bit, I suppose, here, it's always a bit hit and miss in terms of where China stands. It would seem that China's general strategy, which is one which does not change a lot, but benefits in a way from the uncertainty and instability caused by external or negative externalities to the region, allows it to persist in dealing with ASEAN. And I think that really it comes down to whether ASEAN will be capable or not of ceding perhaps on its sovereign individual positions in order to form a united front vis-à-vis China, which would help to advance the individual interests of the member states, but also of the collective. And I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for your insightful sharing. Next, we invite our second plenary speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Eko Widianto, to deliver his presentation titled The Existence of National Law Towards ASEAN Legal Order. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Waalaikumsalam. Good morning for everyone. My name is Eko Widianto, lecturer of Constitutional Law and Legislation in Brawijaya University Faculty of Law, and now I'm dean there. For my brother from Russia, I think you know about our globe. Yes. Last year I go to your university, London University, to teach about the constitutional law. Okay, in this presentation, I will present about the existence of national law toward national legal order. In this forum, there are many students from Brunei, Malaysia, and then Russia, and Indonesia, and our colleagues from the lecturer and the dean. So, in this presentation, there are many theory for the student, but discussion for all of us as a lecturer. Okay, the first about the theory. Next slide. Theory of existence of international law in national law. I want to focus about the Asian to compare with EU, because how we can build legal order in the Asian. Like we know, there are two theories in the existence of international law and international law. The first is monism theory. In this theory, there are incorporation theory, or we call it incorporation theory, viewing national and international law as one entity. And two parts in this theory. First is national legal climate, and the second, yes, international law climate. So it's depend on the national law is codified from international law or international law climate, and provision of international law that do not conflict with international law are immediately self-executing, while those that are deemed to conflict and require legislative approval are non-self-executing. This is one choice in the theory. And the second is about the dualism or pluralism theory. Next slide. We can call it as a transformation theory. In this theory, viewing national and international law in different space with different subject matter in this. And in this theory, it's known as adoption theory, because national law as international law and international law as a national law. And what about the legal system in Asia? Next slide. In Asia, I think it's not a legal system, because it just not just as a legal framework. I think it's very different between legal framework and legal system. About the legal system is a set of basic rules, principles, and instruments governing a particular field or organization. Emphasis, structure, fundamental rules, and general principles. And in this case, I think it's more closer with the legal framework is Asian Charter, because this is just treaties or basic law, not a constitution like EU. Next. And about legal system. Legal system is the entire system of law operating in a country or supranational entity. Cover such of law, institutions, procedure, legal actor, and legal culture. In Indonesia countries, Malaysia has a common law system, Indonesian civil law system, EU. I think this is kind of legal system. In legal system, like we know, there are contained three parts. The first is about the substance of law, and then the culture, and then the structure. But in the legal framework, not all of the structure in the legal framework. Okay, this is just next slide is issue about the differences between legal framework and legal system. Okay, And next, I think this discussion about next slide about Association of Southeast Asian Nation, ASEAN, and legal system of the European Union, EU. Yeah, next. About the history first. Like we know, in 1967, 5 leaders, not prime minister, not a president, but foreign minister in the Bangkok. They signed about the Bangkok Declaration. The aim and the purpose were about cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, technical, educational, and other fields, and in the promotion of regional peace and stability through abiding respect for justice and the rule of law, and adherence to the principle of United Nations Charter. So this is like representing the country not from the president or prime minister, but by the foreign minister. Okay, this is a history like you know. And then about the ASEAN legal framework and legal personality. The ASEAN Charter is legally binding international intra-ASEAN agreement. Next slide. All the government of the 10 member, now the 10 member states of ASEAN have ratified or accepted it. All the 10 ASEAN governments have deposited their instrument of ratification acceptance with the Secretary General of ASEAN. So ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization, not one supranational organization. It is the legal personality of the ASEAN. We make a comparison between legal personality ASEAN and European Union. In civil law system, legal personality commonly calls person or subject of law. Okay, next. The first about the legal basis. ASEAN legal personality, ASEAN Charter, and EU legal personality, Treaty of Lisbon, character intergovernmental, and the EU legal personality, supranational or intergovernmental, and then main principle, consensus, not interference, and then exclusive competence and direct effect of EU law. What about legal power? In the ASEAN legal personality, decision must be adapted to national law, but in EU legal can directly bind state and citizen. About the judicial body, no binding supranational court, and then for the EU, European Court of Justice with binding authority and degree of legal personality limited, but in EU strong and independent. Okay. And then the next about the legal framework of ASEAN versus the legal system of EU. Next. Yes. Next. First about the legal basis. In the ASEAN, based on ASEAN Charter, framework of cooperation, not supranational, with the principle non-interference, sovereignty, and consensus, but on the European Union based on treaty, TU, and treaty on the functioning of European Union, and then a supranational legal order with supremacy and principle, rule of law, and integration of law of the member of the state. And then the next about the legal character. The character of ASEAN intergovernmental organization and many instruments are soft law, implementation depend on member state, and then in the EU supranational legal system, and then binding legal act, regulation, directive, decision enforced by European Court of Justice. And about the institution, no strong regional part, although we have Asian Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, but its character is only consultative, not adjudicative. No, so it's no strong regional part, dispute settlement through diplomacy. But in the EU, European Court of Justice, and General Court with the binding authority, European Parliament and Council as lawmakers. This is a very different institution, and maybe we must think how Asian for the future. Next. And then integration principle. ASEAN way consensus, not interference, but in EU, ever closer union, strong legal economic and political integration. But in ASEAN, just focus on cooperation, not legal integration. About the binding force, in the ASEAN agreement will be binding, but in the EU law directly applicable, so very direct event and supremacy over national law. Okay, next. Yeah, this is I think about the discussion, second discussion, thought on the existence of national law toward Asian legal order. Yeah, I just studied about in Germany legal system, about the legal order in Germany, because Germany as a federal state, yeah, there are many regulations in Germany. So as federation, there are regulation in the federal and then regulation in the state, and then next is regulation in the European Union. So there's pyramids describe about the regulation in Germany. And then in Netherlands, the top of hierarchy of law in Netherlands is provision of treaty or resolution by international institution. But in Germany, not the international institution or international law, the top hierarchy in Germany is national law. It's mean Grundgesetz or Constitution of Germany. So in Netherlands, Constitution is lower than international law in Netherlands. Okay, what about in Indonesia? In Indonesia, the top hierarchy is the Constitution. And after the Constitution, there are no international law. But the principle of international law, when the judge of, especially constitutional judge, make a decision, can use international principles to make a decision in their decision. So, although international law not including hierarchy of law in Indonesia, but in the case of law or government regulation in view of law, Greek Constitution, Indonesian Constitution, the judge can use international law. Okay, so this is the concept. If developing of the theory of the hierarchy, the next part in legislation when use unitary state in Asia. Because in Asia there are two types of legal system, like Indonesia, the civil law, and Malaysia, the common law. So these two kind of hierarchy of legislation in a unitary state in Asia. Yeah, the first is about this picture is about the unitary state, and the second picture is about the federation state in Asia. If, I think if, next slide, yes. If Asian countries agree to make more hard organization, not only soft organization, to organize all of state in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Kowidzierto, for those valuable perspectives. Now, I welcome our last plenary speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Faisal, to take the floor to deliver his presentation titled Optimalisasi Potensi Wakaf Melalui Pendidikan Hukum Wakaf. Please welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mungkin saya mau berpantun Bu, karena di siang hari ini udah mulai lemas ya. Dan saya buat pantun dulu sekitar 2 menit dulu. Belum. Saya mohon izin menggunakan bahasa Melayu, Bapak Ibu sekalian. Ya, tadi beberapa narasumber menggunakan bahasa saya, bukan bahasa seluruh Melayu. Jadi saya akan coba. Sebelumnya saya ingin pantun dulu. Paling tidak berterima kasih kepada Yusim yang telah menyediakan tempat. Ya, apapun ceritanya, kehadiran kita kalau Yusim tidak memperakarsai, terutama berbasmi, kita akan pernah berkumpul di sini. Datang menyapa, membawa salam. Langkah tertata, penuh percaya. Ilmu digali dalam forum alam. Musim bersinar di mata dunia. Terima kasih yang kami hormati para narasumber yang telah menyampaikan materi yang luar biasa. Saya berdiri di sini mewakili forum rektor, forum dekan, Muhammadiyah se-Indonesia, sekaligus ketua prodi
nanti dia akan keluar.
Asosiasi Prodi Muhammadiyah, Hukum Muhammadiyah se-Indonesia.
Tak boleh nak
Sebenarnya banyak yang mau menyampaikan, tapi karena di kita sifatnya itu berembuk dan diputuskan siapa yang paling tinggi dia menyampaikan materi. Dan kebetulan saya paling tinggi, maka saya yang menyampaikan materi hari ini. Baik Bapak-bapak, Ibu-ibu, saudara sekalian peserta konferensi, saya akan mencoba mengambil judul optimalisasi potensi wakaf melalui pendidikan hukum wakaf. Pemikirannya gimana? Bahwa kondisi dunia secara global, baik di Indonesia, baik di negara ASEAN maupun di negara yang ada di dunia, itu persoalan ekonomi itu menjadi hal yang sangat krusial di saat ini. Indonesia misal, pada saat pemerintahan untuk mengumpulkan dana bagaimana menopang pembangunan ekonomi, maka kebijakan menaikkan pajak itu luar biasa diterapkan oleh pemerintah. Di Malaysia juga kemarin kita dengar bahwa kondisi perekonomian di Malaysia juga tidak dalam kondisi baik-baik saja. Secara tingkat perekonomian dunia, Amerika kemarin membuat kebijakan, Presiden Donald Trump juga akan mempengaruhi kebijakan ekonomi dunia secara global. Kondisi ekonomi yang semakin turun, kebijakan-kebijakan yang diambil oleh pemimpin negara itu selalu saja yang mengedepankan potensi membebankan kepada rakyat yang ada. Padahal dalam sistem ekonomi Islam ada hal-hal yang bisa dijadikan modal yang tanpa membebani rakyat dan keterpaksaan rakyat untuk mengumpulkan dana. Misal kalau seandainya kita perhatikan pendirian kampus-kampus awalnya, pendirian sekolah-sekolah awalnya, itu bukanlah berasal dari kapital-kapital pemilik modal yang kita kenal sekarang. Tetapi dari filantropi yang dikumpulkan oleh rakyat, oleh masyarakat, sehingga terbangunlah sekolah-sekolah. Termasuk di perguruan tinggi Muhammadiyah yang ada. Awal-awal pendirian sekolah, pendirian kampus itu bersumber dari dana-dana wakaf. Tanpa kita sadari bahwa awal berdirinya kampus-kampus yang ada, Pada saat Kiai Dahlan memulai gerakan al-ma'unnya, itu adalah dana wakaf, dana infak, dana sedekah. Dan pengumpulan dana wakaf, pengumpulan dana infak, pengumpulan dana sedekah itu tidak ada keberatan dari orang yang mengumpul. Kenapa tidak ini yang kita mulai gali kembali seperti itu? Bapak Ibu, kalau seandainya kita memahami makna wakaf secara hukum Islam atau hukum syariah, secara hukum sebenarnya di dalam Al-Quran tidak pernah ditemukan kalimat wakaf itu sendiri. Padahal itu hukum pokok bagi yang beragama Islam. Kalau kita balik Al-Quran, tidak pernah ada satu kalimat wakaf sama sekali ditemukan. Tetapi kenapa umat Islam senang sekali berwakaf? Terutama generasi-generasi terdahulu kita. Beda dengan generasi sekarang. Ternyata dasar hukum wakaf itu ada di sunnah Rasulullah SAW. Pada saat sahabat Umar bin Khattab menghadap Rasulullah, beliau berkata, "Wahai Rasulullah, saya baru saja mendapat satu harta dari rampasan perang di daerah Khaybar. Harta yang saya peroleh ini sangat baik, sangat bagus. Yang saya selama memiliki harta belum pernah memiliki harta sebaik dan sebagus ini." Umar berkata kepada Rasulullah, "Apa perintahmu?" Beda sama kita. Kalau punya harta, punya uang, nggak pernah kita ngomong ke presiden kita, ke pemimpin kita, "Saya punya uang, mau dikemanain?" Nggak pernah. Kalau bisa disimpan. Sama juga wakil lokal dekan saya, kaprodi saya, kalau dapat bagian itu nggak pernah lapor pada dekan, "Saya dapat uang pada nggak pernah itu Bapak Ibu." Tapi umat beda karakternya. Itu punya harta, dia datang kepada Rasulullah, dia tanya, "Mau diapakan ini harta?" Kalau saya jadi Rasulullah, saya bilang, "Sini Umar, sini hartamu di saya." Tapi Rasulullah ternyata beda Bapak Ibu. Dan Rasulullah paham karakter umat. Dari orang yang sangat kaya raya, setelah masuk Islam menjadi orang yang paling miskin. Rasul berpikir, kalaulah ku ikuti kemauan Umar, sementara Umar sekarang tidak memiliki apa-apa, kalau ku katakan Umar, sedekahkan, wakafkan hartamu, pasti Umar lakukan. Tapi Rasul berpikir, kasihan Umar, dia juga punya generasi, dia punya anak istri, dia juga punya keluarga. Selama ini harta yang ada sama dia selalu disumbangkan untuk perjuangan agama. Lalu Rasul berkata, "Umar, jika kamu suka," jadi makna hukumnya nanti tidak ada di sini paksaan. "Umar, jika kamu rela tahan pokoknya, sedekahkan hasilnya." Jadi ternyata kalimat tahan itu setelah dibolak-balik itulah arti dari kata wakaf. Maknanya apa? Rasul katakan, "Umar, kebun kurma daerah Khaybar tetap kau menjadi milikmu, tetap kau pegang haknya, tapi hasilnya itulah yang kau sedekahkan." Ternyata Bapak Ibu, kenapa lambat perkembangan wakaf terutama di Indonesia selama ini? Pemahaman makna wakaf itu yang keliru ternyata. Kalau di daerah kami dulu, kalau cerita wakaf selalu berkaitan dengan makam, selalu berkaitan dengan rumah ibadah, masjid. Ada harta untuk perkuburan, untuk makam, ada harta bangun masjid. Sehingga tidak heran kita kalau di Indonesia itu ya perobaan ya, masjid itu kadang jaraknya bisa 10 meter, 50 meter gitu. Beda dengan negara-negara Islam yang ada di Timur Tengah, masjidnya itu cukup jauh gitu. Karena sugestinya apa? Sugestinya dari hadis Rasul juga ternyata. Apa kata Rasul? Apabila matinya anak Adam maka putus segala amal kecuali 3 hal. Salah satunya adalah sedekah jariyah atau sedekah yang berkepanjangan, itulah dari wakaf. Jadi nenek kita punya harta wakaf, bangun masjid. Punya harta wakaf, bangun kuburan. Punya harta wakaf, bangun masjid, bangun kuburan. Dan ini juga tidak salah ternyata. Ternyata ini didasarkan pemikiran dari keyakinan mazhab yang dipegang oleh pendahulu kita. Mayoritas kan di ASEAN ini Ini kan mazhabnya Syafi'iyah. Karena Imam Syafi'i memaknai bahwa harta wakaf itu adalah harta yang berkekalan, bendanya, dan tidak boleh dia dialihkan ke yang lain. Itu maknanya. Sehingga kelambatan pelaksanaan wakaf itu karena beranggapan bahwa harta wakaf itu benda tetap saja. Harta wakaf itu benda yang tidak boleh dialihkan. Itu yang selalu ini yang terjadi. Padahal jika kita maknai Bapak Ibu saudara sekalian, peran penting dalam pembangunan kondisi sekarang ini itu wakaf itu sangat kondisi wakaf itu sangat penting. Bagaimana kalau seandainya wakaf itu dimaknai seperti mazhab Syafi'iyah, bagaimana pembangunan yang menggunakan cash dana sekarang itu bisa bergerak, bisa cepat. Ternyata dari beberapa pemahaman mazhab, tidak hanya mazhab Syafi'iyah, lalu dielaborasi dalam Undang-Undang Wakaf di Indonesia 41/2004 dibuka ruang untuk wakaf produktif yang itu tidak saja berupa benda tetap seperti pemahaman Syafi'iyah, bisa dengan menggunakan wakaf tunai. Tinggal saja bagaimana agar wakaf ini bisa sesuai dengan yang diinginkan. Kita berharap di fakultas-fakultas hukum yang ada di Indonesia, di Malaysia, pendidikan tentang wakaf itu digalakkan. Pendidikan tentang bagaimana hukum wakaf itu bisa dilaksanakan. Sehingga pada saat negara dalam krisis, kampus dalam krisis kondisi sekarang, terutama di Indonesia, yang minat masyarakat untuk kuliah rendah, itu tidak terganggu cash flow dari pelaksanaan kampusnya. Dan dana wakaf itu bisa dijadikan dana abadi, sedikit pun mahasiswanya kampusnya tidak akan tutup. Kita miris kondisi sekarang, terutama di Indonesia, banyak kampus yang mulai khawatir apakah proses, terutama kampus swasta, apakah proses operasional kampus bisa berjalan karena dengan minimnya mahasiswa atau masyarakat untuk kuliah, karena kondisi ekonomi sedang tidak baik-baik saja. Mungkin itu yang bisa saya sampaikan sebagai pengantar. Harapan paling besar adalah bagaimana membangun hukum wakaf ini bisa disampaikan atau bisa diajarkan, dimasukkan di dalam kurikulum fakultas hukum yang ada di Indonesia. Sehingga pada saat dibutuhkan fundraising, dan rakyat dengan kerelaan hati, dengan niat bahwa saya sumbangkan harta saya bukan hanya untuk kepentingan dunia, tapi untuk kepentingan akhirat. Mungkin demikian, terima kasih, diperbanyak maaf. Nasrullah wa fatun karim wa bacirul mu'minin. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
For these presentations. And thank you very much to all our panelists for such a rich discussions. And we'll now open floor for a joint Q&A session.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the best interest of time, if we may limit the questions, one question for each presenter. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Am my voice audible enough? Okay, thank you. My name is Shania. I'm currently in my second year in Faculty of Law, Universitas Singapura Bangsa Karo, Indonesia. And I would like to address my question to Dr. Benjamin Barton. And thank you very much, Dr. Barton, for your excellent presentation. Okay. I found your explanation about China's push and pull methodology and its overarching aim to become the regional hegemon particularly insightful. So what struck me most is how Asia often finds itself catch between inducements and coercion, with some member states benefiting from China's economic opportunities, while others remain vulnerable due to poverty and internal divisions. Also, at the same time, Asian governments now face a double balancing act, such as managing deeper economic integration with China while dealing with growing pressure from advanced economies to reduce reliance on China's supply chains. So these tensions is likely to intensify under new tariffs from the US and China's decoupling efforts, raising questions about Asia's future. So my question is, in your view, can Asia realistically evolve into a more cohesive and resilient institution that collectively navigates these economics and political pressures, or will it remain fragmented and reactive in the face of great power competition? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent question, somewhat a loaded question as well. Okay. Yeah, I think that up until now, we can say that a lot of the ASEAN member states have been pretty good at what the international relations literature would say is called hedging. So hedging is effectively when you're seeking to get the best out of both worlds. That is the trade and investment benefits of dealing with China, and the security benefits usually or normally provided by another external party. We could say that in the case of some of the ASEAN member states, that's the United States. If you think of the Philippines, if you think of Singapore to a certain extent, if you think of Thailand to a certain extent. ASEAN member states have been pretty good at that, and I guess it begs the question of why should they change? Why should they change this approach which has been so beneficial? Now, from the outside looking in, there always seems to be a lot of pressure on the ASEAN member states to change, right? That effectively they have to choose a side. Which side are you going to choose? Yeah. Are you going to lean towards the United States or are you going to lean towards China? That's a very simplistic overview which is painted, right? And how ASEAN member states should deal with the, let's say, the geopolitical backdrop. But actually, what the data shows is that the more pressure on ASEAN member states, the more they hedge, the more successful the hedge, actually, right? So I think that up until now, and I come back to Prof. Ratnam's presentation, he said that ASEAN is a zone of peace and has been for a number of decades. So that's what allows these member states to hedge. So I think that for as long as that does not change, then I don't see why the individual member states should divert away from that path. They're all pursuing their own national interests, and actually, collectively, ASEAN allows them to do that, and the peace and security around the region allows them to do that. I suppose the underlying question is, and I mentioned this in my presentation, is, and this is also a theme you can see from a legal perspective and a political perspective, is can this last, how long can this last for? And can ASEAN do more for itself regionally and for its member states by, let's say, having a collective foreign policy, something like that? I think it's difficult to answer that question because ASEAN, up until now, wants to maintain its principles, which is the ASEAN way, right? And I think that politically that's the cheaper option. The more expensive option is to say let's create a collective institutional framework which allows us to talk as one voice, which I think that actually would allow ASEAN to get a lot more out of this relationship with China. But that's a more politically costly option because you need to find a collective political will to help build that institutional framework. And I don't think that that's necessarily there because there's no push for politicians across ASEAN to do that. And I suppose, and I'll just end here because otherwise I'll keep going on and on. I suppose if you want to make a comparison, because comparisons being made with the EU, if you just look at foreign policy, you know, it took the EU 5 decades to come up with something like an institutional framework for foreign policy, which is known as Common Foreign and Security Policy. But actually, academics who work on that say it doesn't work very well. Why? Because you always have the lowest common denominator of 1 or 2 member states who can decimate a united position. Right? In the EU, you have Hungary, or Greece, or sometimes Slovakia, Slovenia, sometimes very small member states. But it only takes one to derail an entire collective position. And in ASEAN, I think those member states are well known. Yeah? So I think that it has to be part of a longer term reflection, and you are the younger generations who will carry this forward. You know, is this something which really brings added value? Is it really needed or not? Or does ASEAN simply continue as it is to hedge? And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you to Associate Professor Dr. Barton. Now, do we have another question for which speaker?
So, my name is Kuntari Amrani. I'm from Brawijaya University, Master of Law. I will give my question in bahasa. So, pertanyaan saya tentang wakaf, Bapak. Seperti kita ketahui di generasi saya dan Gen Z pada umumnya, kami hampir tidak percaya lagi dengan organisasi sosial dan lembaga amal karena berita akhir-akhir ini isinya tentang korupsi, apalagi mega korupsi organisasi sosial terbesar di negara kita saat ini. Tantangannya adalah bagaimana generasi kami akan percaya kepada wakaf dan charity, karena pada akhirnya kami akhirnya melakukan charity ini tidak dengan gerakan yang masif, tapi dengan gerakan yang lebih kecil, lebih private seperti itu. Dan pada akhirnya gerakan ekonomi umat ini tidak berjalan seperti itu. Bagaimana cara menyelesaikan tantangan tersebut? Terima kasih. Thank you.
Ya, baik, terima kasih. Pertanyaan yang bagus ya. Dan ini juga memang menjadi fenomena ya, pemahaman wakaf di generasi kekinian itu sangat sulit. Apakah pemahaman secara agama kurang? Saya rasa tidak. Tetapi karena memang contoh yang ditunjukkan oleh pengelola wakaf itu yang tidak mencerminkan sesuai dengan tuntunan wakaf sendiri. Yang kedua, kalau saya memandangnya adalah bahwa aturan wakaf di negara kita itu belum sesuai dengan aturan wakaf itu sendiri. Wakaf itu kan secara filosofis jauh sebelum Indonesia merdeka itu sudah ada di negara kita. Dan itu adalah instrumen hukum mandiri sebenarnya. Tetapi dalam praktik perwakafan di kita, dia disandingkan atau ditempelkan dalam instrumen hukum lain. Contoh misal, pada saat badan hukum yayasan itu ada mengelola harta wakaf, hanya ditempelkan saja di samping nama yayasan jadi wakaf. Lalu ada badan hukum juga, yayasan wakaf yang badan hukum, misalnya perseroan terbatas, lembaga pendidikan, gitu. Padahal secara filosofis wakaf itu di atas badan hukum yang lain. Dalam artian, setelah ada lembaga wakaf, badan hukum wakaf baru dibentuk yayasan, perseroan, atau badan-badan hukum lain. Yang ketiga memang, pengelola ini tidak menjalankan prinsip daripada wakaf sesuai dengan ketentuan syariah. Seyogianya orang yang menjalankan dan mengelola lembaga-lembaga filantropi seperti wakaf, itu kan memang orang yang memang memiliki kemampuan berlebih, Bu. Seharusnya kan tidak dianggap lembaga itu menjadi lahan mencari kerja. Beda dengan di luar negeri, pada saat mereka ingin mendirikan yayasan, memang mereka mendonasikan sebagian harta mereka yang berlebih. Tapi dalam konsep wakaf sesungguhnya, itu yang dituntut adalah bagaimana memanajemen diri untuk manajemen harta yang ada pada diri seseorang itu di-sharingkan kepada orang lain. Karena Rasulullah pada saat itu tidak mengatakan serahkan ke sana. Kalau dari konsep hukum dasarnya itu tahan pokoknya. Berarti Rasul ngomong di Umar, kau tetap kelola kebun kurmamu itu, kau rawat kebun kurmamu, kalau sudah panen, buahnya kau kasihkan ke orang. Tetapi tetap harta wakaf itu milikmu, dan kau juga dengan keluargamu boleh mengambilnya. Tetapi kan memang kalau seandainya itu diterapkan ANSI, maka tidak akan bisa konsep wakaf ini membiayai hal-hal yang berskala global. Oleh karena itu di zaman sahabat juga dibentuklah kelembagaan-kelembagaan wakaf, ditunjuklah nazir untuk mengelola wakaf. Persoalannya Ibu, di samping memang tidak amanah, nazir kita juga tidak memahami esensi dari tugas nazir. Jadi pendidikan wakaf itu penting. Saya mohon izin disertasi saya terkait dengan kelembagaan wakaf. Saya katakan bahwa nazir kita harus menjadi manajer-manajer profesional. Nazir jangan berorientasi ini sebagai amal sosial, amal ibadah, tapi bagaimana ini suatu lembaga yang bisa menghasilkan uang. Dan luar biasa kalau seandainya dikelola sedemikian rupa. Di Indonesia saja berdasarkan data dari BWI, potensi wakaf itu bisa sampai 4.000 triliun, Ibu. Tetapi baru yang bisa diserap itu baru 500-an miliar. Ini menunjukkan bahwa apa? Yang pertama saya katakan keseriusan pemerintah untuk menjadikan lembaga wakaf sebagai badan hukum mandiri itu tidak serius. Yang kedua, keseriusan pemerintah untuk memberikan pendidikan kepada najir sebagai pengelola wakaf itu juga tidak pernah dijalankan. Jadi itu sebenarnya Ibu. Kita berharap memang jangan di generasi-generasi ini ya udahlah kami sendiri aja, ini kan buat gerakan Jumat Berkah, buat gerakan ini kan individu-individu sehingga tidak bisa tergeneralkan, bisa tujuan itu bisa secara maksimal. Jadi sebaiknya kalau di kita di Indonesia yang pertama hukum perwakafan itu harus dibenahi secara total. Yang kedua pelatihan memberikan pemahaman kepada nazir sebagai pihak yang menghimpun, mengelola dan mendiskusikan wakaf itu harus benar-benar dimaksimalkan. Dan yang paling terakhir bahwa generasi sekarang jangan beranggapan pada saat kita melaksanakan wakaf itu hanya kepentingan dunia, itu juga menyangkut kepentingan akhirat yang sugestinya kan seperti itu. Meninggal pun kita tidak bisa berbuat amal tapi kemanfaatannya mengalir terus, kan sugestinya di situ. Dan itu memang keyakinan yang harus ditanamkan kepada generasi kita. Mungkin itu Ibu. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Dr. Faisal, for your answers. Now we open for another questions for Associate Professor Dr. Anita Widianto.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Riza from Malaysia Coast Guard. As question for the Professor Dr. Benjamin. You mentioned earlier that China acquires social loans and investments. To what extent could the Peru initiative related debts of infrastructure commitments limit Malaysia's freedom of action in defending its EEZ and South China Sea claims?
Sorry, could you please repeat the question?
To what extent could the Belt Road and Initiative related debts or infrastructures commitments limit Malaysia's freedom of action in defending its EEZ and South China Sea claims?
Okay, thank you for repeating the question. That's an excellent question. I would say not much, to be honest with you, because what we're seeing is the Belt and Road Initiative has always been portrayed as a form of, equally a form of Chinese grand strategy written by the Chinese state and implemented across the world. But actually, if you look at the way that, let's say, the business model underpinning it, it involves a wide range of different actors, ranging from Chinese provinces to state-owned enterprises and so on and so forth. So I suppose the question is, where does the ownership really lie? And as we've seen in Malaysia particularly, local political actors play a very important role in determining, what kind of projects, how much financing, how do you renegotiate the debt, and so on and so forth. So I think it is a perfectly legitimate question, and one which has been asked. If a state is accumulating a certain amount of debt towards China or Chinese policy banks, does that limit the ability of that state to, let's say, exert its agency, its political agency, and in this case, its ability to defend itself? My answer to that would be no, because ultimately, it's one thing doing business, it's one thing accumulating debt, but it's another being able to use that to encroach upon the sovereignty of other states. And I don't think that China is in the business of doing that for multiple reasons, but I suppose the most important reason being the image it projects of itself around the world. So let's say it was to do that here in Malaysia by saying that Malaysia has accumulated a certain amount of debt due to X number of Belt and Road Initiative projects. If it was to limit Malaysia's ability to express its agency through its naval power, what would be the ramifications of that for its image globally and even back home in China? We've seen cases of even smaller states with weaker power, in fact sometimes with no power, no military power, such as the likes of Djibouti or even Maldives, be able to express their foreign policy interests and their agency, even though they've accumulated debt which is of a far more worse consequence to the overarching nature of their economy vis-à-vis China. And yet they're still able to do things which I guess most commentators think would not be possible in dealing with the Chinese. So I think in your question there's an element of risk which has to be noted, which is that economic risk of exposing oneself too much to one particular partner, a partner whose strategic intentions aren't always clear. But I can't say and would argue that there's a lot of evidence to support that China's been able to use the Belt and Road Initiative to get other countries to change their foreign policies in the way that China would want to. So actually, although there was, I think, a lot of apprehension initially about this, about 7 or 8 years into it, the data doesn't really support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions, perhaps to Associate Professor Dr. Anika Widiarto? Yes.
This. Okay. Thank you. My name is Teguh Kamal Zaman. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a student Faculty of Law, University of Singapore, Sarawak. I have one question to Mr. Anika Widiarto about the legal system. I'll have a question, Mr. An. Our country must have the legal system. For the example, Indonesian in civil law and Malaysian common law. So, how to determine the legal system to provide the country according to needs of society? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I think it's very interesting what the effectiveness of the legal system, I think, yes. Like we know about the treatment theory, effectivity of legal system, there are three kind of part in the legal system. I think it's no problem in common law or in civil law. The first is about the substance of law. If in the common or the civil law, the substance of law is good, can protect of human rights, can divide power, and so there are any check and balances system in the country. I think in the country will get a good legal system, or we can call it prosperity and then justice for all, for the people in the same dignity, in the same right, can be implemented if the substance of law is can protect of human rights or can protect the people. And the second is about the structure of law. Structure is the main official that have a duty to do this law or to make law can implement it when some people have broken the law. Like in this case, judge, police, and then prosecutor. If they are doing their job good and then can make the law effective. So in civil law or in common law can implement
last is about the substance, structure, and the culture of the people. Actually, in the common law system, the culture is stable for long time. So, like in England, there is no written constitution, but they can know the matter of the constitution. So, unwritten constitution in England, maybe Mr. Bunyamin know well about the England constitution. There are no written constitution, but to effective to make common law system can implement it well in the England. And in civil law, the culture of the people to obey the law is one key too. So when in Indonesia, like us here in civil law, the people can easily look the regulation in the written law, like our constitution, government regulation, provincial regulation, etc. Thank you very much.
For your answers. Now we open for the last questions of today's plenary sessions, so that will be Ms. Liz.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Elisa from Madrid University of Sukabumi. My question is for Prof. Benjamin. Thank you, Prof, for your outstanding presentation. In your previous presentation, you mentioned about China economic investment and military question. So my question is, how does China's strategy of combining the military coalition in the South Asia with economic investment to set a balance of power in Southeast Asia? I think that's all my question. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you for your question. Okay, I think as a general rule, China is, when it comes to its security policy, its security interests, and the deployment of its military hardware, its military personnel, if you think about big powers, if you think about the members of the P5, for instance, China's track record is one of being somewhat reluctant to get involved in spats which don't involve its direct territorial sovereignty, right? Of course, some would say that the maritime sovereignty is adjacent or auxiliary to its territorial sovereignty. But I think generally speaking, there's been where others have perhaps expected China to want to engage militarily, the Chinese have not directly. Of course, indirectly, China seems to be quite proficient at masking its military intentions, and we've seen that across the region. When it's provoked, it stands up to the provocation, and it warns others not to provoke. So that's the military angle. I think that, of course, China's military, its naval power, its air power, for the most part, I think one can consider it to be defensive in nature, meaning that it's there to protect. I don't think it's yet offensive in nature, but that's what it's building towards, and it's still very much under construction. I think probably the more problematic element is that of economic inducement or coercion, depending on when it's applied, because I think for the countries in the region this is of greater interest. Everyone is working towards the same aspiration to improve standards of living, right? To enrich oneself. I think that's something that perhaps ASEAN can agree on. That's an aim. And of course, that's not possible nowadays without working through and with China, because China remains still the manufacturing hub of the world, where most goods are finalized and shipped off. In fact, in Southeast Asia, there's been somewhat of a change, where Southeast Asian nations used to produce manufactured goods which were bought by China. China is slowly but surely taking over some of those industries as well, right? So that creates another element of concern. But, the way that China's been quite good at marketing itself is by wanting to be there as a support, going all the way back to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in the early 2000s, followed by the Free Trade Agreement signed by ASEAN, which is now one of the most advanced free trade agreements in the world. It's been upgraded 3 times now. It seems that everything's moving in the right direction, except for when there are concerns. So, for instance, when the Vietnamese decide to protest the presence of China in its exclusive economic zone, or when the Philippines protests the demarcation of the 9-dash line, China's been quite adept at using economic statecraft to remind member states of the risks of pushing the boundaries too far. So if you think back to the response the Chinese gave to the Philippines following its decision to take China to court in The Hague and ultimately be successful, China leveraged trade on bananas, which might seem very benign, but it actually was quite painful for the incumbent Filipino government and that particular province in the Philippines because of the export market which Filipino bananas represented to China. And these are the kind of things which, they're not acts of outright hostility, but they are, targeted and they can hurt. So I think that this is the issue that often ASEAN member states face, is that they are then sidelined because this is purely an issue for the Philippines. It's not an issue for ASEAN, even though China's claims over the South China Sea are clearly an issue for ASEAN collectively, right? So I think that's where China's been quite adept at managing the security component, the economic component, and the diplomatic component in terms of the projection it gives to the rest of the region. And I'll finish by saying this is, often I get asked now, how should China respond to, the actions of President Trump in the world, or let's say specific to this region? Actually, China doesn't have to do much, and gains, in fact, from the actions of others. And I think that's where its soft power comes into play, because it's quite good at acting in a fairly low-key manner and letting others perhaps take the limelight, but actually, operating perhaps in the shadows and operating effectively. Anyway, thank you very much for your question. I hope that addresses it.
Thank you very much. Okay, now, thank you for the thought-provoking exchange. With that, we are concluding our plenary sessions. Let us show our appreciation to our distinguished panelists with a round of applause again. Now, we invite Associate Professor Dr. Hasmi Muhammad Rusli to deliver his short remarks. Please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum. Especially to our friends from Indonesia. I know that many of you flew all the way from Sumatra to Papua. Let us give them a round of applause. Professor Vivian Fox, who is heading up out there, he flew, just to share with you,